So now we're going to morph quickly into our opening panel, and I'm going to ask our three panelists to come and join us here on the stage. Dr. Harvey Weingarten, Danika Billie Littlechild, and Shelley Sapieha. And their bios are in the program, so I'm not going to take a whole lot of other time introducing them. We're going to get right into it. We're going to start off the session, which is a dialogue, and I have some questions that we've sort of thought about beforehand, but there will also, I hope, be a chance to have questions from the floor and to steer the discussion. We really want to talk about rebooting how we recognize learning, and these three people, I think, are in positions where they are actually helping us to do that, and it's their stories and insights that we are looking for this morning. But I thought we might just start by asking, and start with Harvey, how did you get into all of this?
By accident. I've worked in universities a long time, lastly in the University of Calgary. For a whole set of reasons, decided to move to Toronto, and then I had the opportunity to take up this role in the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. It's largely there that I began to encounter the issues of recognizing prior learning and quality assurance more than I did before. That's very embarrassing to say. I was a provost at McMaster, I was the president at Calgary, and I didn't actually start thinking about prior learning assessment and quality control of academic programs till I actually got to the Higher Education Quality Council. I had other things that I had to do in those places. Look, our job is to advise the provincial government on issues that would improve access, quality, and accountability of the Ontario public post-secondary system. The Ontario system represents 40% of all higher education enrollments in Canada, 20 universities, 24 colleges. It is one of the largest public post-secondary systems in the world. When you look to see some of the more exciting things and progressive things that are happening in higher education, competency-based credentialing, recognition of prior learning, learning outcomes are at the very forefront and are certainly some of the most central and some of the most exciting things happening in higher education. Typically, what you do at a university or a college is someone leaves, you give them a piece of paper, a transcript that has the courses they took and the grades they took. That's largely uninformative. And we are now seeing a move towards institutions credentialing not only courses and grades, but credentialing as well what competencies and what skills students are leaving with, a much more valuable piece of paper than the traditional transcript. Anyone like us that worries about how to meet the public post-secondary challenge, which, by the way, it's the challenge that Ontario faces, it's the challenge that every province in Canada faces, it's the challenge that every state in the United States faces, it's the challenge that virtually every country around the world is facing. And that is, how do you give a better education to more students with no more money? And when you start thinking like that and thinking about how we can use the funds we put into higher education in the most effective, useful, relevant way, you immediately come to the issue of we have to do a much better job of recognizing the credentials, the skills, the competencies that students come to when they enter our institutions. And so for us, it's very simple. I come to a conference like this, And we worry about these problems because our job is to give the best advice to government how to use their dollars that they're prepared to put into public higher education, how to use that money most effectively. And there's no doubt that using that money more effectively involves better recognition of the skills and competencies and knowledge that students come into the system, not making them duplicate what they already know and can do, giving them credentials that speak to their skills and competencies, not just to the courses they took. And if we can get that right, as an expert panel we convened to look at the Ontario system said, if the Ontario system can get that right, it would immediately catapult the Ontario public higher education system into being one of the leading public post-secondary systems in the world. We're not there yet. There are a huge number of bureaucratic and cultural barriers, but that's all they are. They're bureaucratic and cultural barriers. The solutions are obvious. They're actually not that difficult, and we spend a lot of time encouraging government and institutions to get on with this. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Danika, can I ask you the same question? How has your journey brought you here today?
Well, first let me say, to begin in my language, I think is very important, my language of Cree from the Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. Thank you to Tim for giving us such a beautiful opening and recognizing the territories that we're currently meeting at. So I was born and raised in Neasqueak, also known as Ermineskin Cree Nation, out in Treaty 6 Reserve, about an hour southeast of Edmonton. And I was sort of raised with two different knowledge systems sort of coexisting. That of the Cree and that of what I'll call sort of mainstream at the time that I was growing up. And to give you some context, I'm about to turn 40. So, you know, 97 was the year I graduated from my undergrad. So I was thinking, is it really 20 years? My experience sort of as a young person and a learner through my life has been one of balancing or attempting to sort of reconcile within myself the informal education I received of our own Cree knowledge systems, our own Cree legal traditions, with those that I learned sort of in formal education. And trying to understand how to articulate the knowledge base that I received from my family and my community with that which I was receiving sort of in the formal larger institutions. So I did my undergrad at Carleton here in Ottawa in political science, and then I did a law degree at the University of Toronto. And so both of my parents actually attended residential school, which had a big impact on my life and the lives of all people in our community. That experience has sort of been a big part of that concept of reconciliation and trying to find the linkages where the Indigenous forms of learning can sort of coexist in a positive way with mainstream sort of knowledge systems. And so that, you know, took me sort of on this journey as a professional as well. So when I began to practice law, I had to then engage with, you know, a legal system that didn't necessarily recognize the value of Indigenous knowledge systems or Indigenous forms of learning in the way that you know, decisions were made or conflicts were resolved. And so it was really a challenge for me to be one of the first, and I was the first woman in my community to become a lawyer, to be one of the first to try to describe this reconciliation process for the First Nations that I worked with, but also for the non-Indigenous peoples that I was working with. And so part of what helped me a lot in this process was actually the work that I've done with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. So I began working with them in 2002. Sort of as a youth member, and for those younger people in the room, apparently the international definition of youth extends to 30. So you can really stretch your youth out. So I did at the Canadian Commission, and I eventually sort of focused my work with them on culture, communication, and information. And of course, a lot of Indigenous knowledge systems are sometimes regulated to this concept of culture or this category of culture, when in fact Indigenous knowledge systems span many different sectors and are not, I don't think, easily sort of contained within a cultural rubric. And so working with the Canadian Commission since that time, I've been able to find sort of empathetic and amazing people who are engaged with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, which, by the way, is made up of members of civil society, both individuals and organizations, who are sort of experts in their fields, and these includes academics and professionals, lots of different types of organizations. And so I have found that people who are in leadership roles in institutions are very amenable to the concept of Indigenous forms of learning. Where the challenge lies is sort of in the functionality of that acceptance. What does that look like on a day-to-day basis within the types of institutions that we're sort of targeting to recognize Indigenous forms of learning, for example? And so UNESCO is an ideal place to have this discussion, because UNESCO is intended to be sort of a laboratory of ideas, a standard setter, and a catalyst for international sharing and intellectual cooperation. And so those three sort of main mandates of UNESCO and how that plays out here in Canada, I think, is where some of the opportunity is from my perspective. And so maybe I'll leave it at that, and we can talk a little bit more later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shelley, again, the same question. What has your journey been like as in the field of recognition of prior learning?
My story started just over a year ago. I was making application to a master's program at Dalhousie, and being a lifelong learner without an undergrad or the credentials to enter a master's program, part of the package that I received from Dalhousie had a CAPLA and PLAR literature on how someone like myself, who had to apply experience to their application, would benefit and would have the board consider me as a learner within the graduate study program. I believe my story aligns to the principle of access within RPL. I feel like it's the good, the bad, and maybe even the ugly of my situation, as it was great that I had the literature that came with the admissions package, yet it was just that, it was just literature. And so as I was sort of at the 11th hour before that application needed to be submitted, I reread my RPL, I read my portfolio, and I felt stuck. And so what I had done is I researched more about CAPLA on the internet and found Bonnie's name. And as I reached out to Bonnie, she took the time to listen to my story and connected me with the Prior Learning Center in Halifax. And I was able to then connect with Teresa Francis by telephone and speak with her about my 11th hour, either abandonment of my application or my pursuit forward. And after speaking with Teresa for a lengthy amount of time, and I appreciate both Bonnie and Teresa spent a number of minutes on the phone with me. I'm in Calgary, Alberta. They're out what I consider east, and so I then sent my full portfolio to Teresa for review, and only got back some grammatical changes, and had then submitted to the university and was accepted to start in the summer of 2014.
Well, hats off to you, and hats off to Dalhousie as well.
Yes, yes.
Not the reception that some of us have come to expect from universities when it comes to RPL. Harvey. How are you finding it in Ontario?
So Ontario is at a crossroads. It has a large system. It's financially unsustainable. Some of the institutions, won't put a number on them, are having great difficulty making ends meet. And we know that we also have a system in Ontario where I could provide you whatever documentation you want, but the system is designed and funded in such a way, given that the growth of the system, that quality of the student experience goes down every year. And we also know that that even though we've done extraordinarily well in Ontario in terms of growth and access, participation rates, we know that there are segments of the Ontario population that don't have equal access to our institutions, and frankly, that's a huge problem because in many ways those are the people who would benefit the most from a post-secondary education. So we need to change. Again, the problems being faced in Ontario are not fundamentally different than those being faced by almost every jurisdiction we know. What is striking to us is that governments around the world have gravitated to a small core set of strategies to deliver a better education to more students with no more money. Ontario is beginning to talk about some of those things, but is not there yet. And if we don't get there soon, and if we don't do it well, we will continue to disadvantage some of the underrepresented groups. We will continue to see an erosion of quality in the Ontario system, and we will see some institutions having a huge amount of trouble paying the electrical bill. And so the question is, how do we get on with this? And again, our job is to do research and to provide evidence-based analysis to the government and to institutions to how we can redress some of this. And I would say that in general, I'm not going to single out Ontario, Canada lags behind other countries in terms of the friskiness, in terms of what they're prepared to do, in terms of innovation and risk-taking to address the issues that Ontario and other provinces face.
Thank you very much. Danika, in your comments about growing up in Alberta, you talked about the two cultures. And I have an image of you, at a school and then at home with the two pieces of two different cultures. Can you tell us more about how you make that fit into a vision of who you are, or how life for others in your situation would be?
Well, for myself, I think I was extremely fortunate that I had the kind of support that we've heard described for people who come in with sort of prior forms of learning from Indigenous communities. So my flippant answer would be with great difficulty, but my more in-depth answer is, properly to recognize the support that I did receive. So for example, when I began my university studies at Carleton, it just so happened that that year Carleton University had hired my aunt to run an Aboriginal center at the university. And so I had sort of a built-in support system as soon as I began my studies, with somebody with whom I was very familiar and comfortable. But I would say that that was a unique situation. And at that time, she was really one of the only supports, however, because I did not see myself reflected in either the faculty or in the curriculum. And so it was often a challenge, actually, to try to understand what my role was as an Indigenous student in political science. Of course, I began my studies shortly after HEQCO happened. So there were a lot of issues that would come up in class, and everybody would sort of turn to me and say, okay, tell us what to think about this. And of course, I was, 17, 18 years old, and it was hard for me to come up with responses that could capture, the entire history of the challenges that Indigenous peoples have faced in general, but in particular, how do you begin to articulate the value of Indigenous knowledge systems at that age or at that time in your life as a learner? And I think that that's part of sort of the journey that I've gone through, is beginning to understand what that sounds like, what that conversation sounds like, and beginning to have that conversation with as many people as possible. And we're really lucky in my First Nation. We have our own cultural college, actually, which serves as a bridge between Indigenous peoples who are on the reserve to basically go through the cultural college and then move on to sort of the mainstream learning institutions. And so I think that it's sort of mechanisms like that that are created by and for Indigenous peoples that are incredibly helpful. But I would agree with Harvey that we need to make this somehow more palatable or more attractive for the mainstream institutions to start investing in. And how does that happen? And I think part of it is not just to have advocacy from the usual suspects, but to try to create champions in other sectors as well. So for example, if it's an engineering program, having a professional engineering association promote this concept of space and place as described by Indigenous peoples. I think that would be fabulous. Certainly we're seeing it more in the legal profession. We're seeing a lot more people interested in Indigenous legal traditions and what that could look like. University of Victoria is considering putting in a new degree program called Bachelor of Indigenous Laws, which would be taught by Indigenous professors with Indigenous legal content. So not Canadian law about us, but our law about ourselves. And so it's those kinds of initiatives, I think, that will make a significant difference in the future. And those types of initiatives are also reflected in the work that UNESCO has done in terms of trying to promote this concept of education for all. What does that really mean? Education for all. It doesn't just mean giving people an opportunity to engage in the mainstream learning system, but it also means sort of empowering informal and non-formal ways of knowing. I think that the work that UNESCO has done to try to promote this concept over the last decade is really important and will be important in the future, because some of you may know, let's just take a quick survey. How many people have heard of the Millennium Development Goals? So say about half of you. So those goals were created by the United Nations as sort of an aspirational set of goals to accomplish by 2015, and one of them was to achieve universal primary education, and UNESCO had a big role in implementing that. Now that we're coming to 2015, we know that we have not succeeded. And even what the content of that goal is has been debated extensively. UNESCO published a global monitoring report every year on how, basically a report card of how we were doing in achieving this goal. And unfortunately, what we were finding was that it's sort of a challenge with youth and disadvantaged people, vulnerable populations like Indigenous peoples, who were leaving school without the skills that they needed to find good employment and to have good lives. And so basically, this concept of a basic right to education, I think, needs to be expanded. And what we're going to see in the next decade is the post-2015 development agenda. So that's, again, a United Nations initiative. This time, it is sort of being forwarded by the states, by the nation states themselves. So whereas the MDGs were sort of crafted by the UN as sort of a bureaucracy, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are being crafted by countries who have been negotiating over the last 2 years as to what the content of these goals are. One of them is on education, and this time the goal reads, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So I would say that some of the critiques of this concept of universal education have been heard and acknowledged by states, because this is a state-led drafting process. And so I think that, that this process of the SDGs is something that all of you should try to inform yourselves about, because it's your expertise that will inform what these sustainable development goals are able to accomplish, including this goal in education. And there is still time to have input into the finalization of the draft, which I can provide to anybody who's interested.
Thank you so much. Shelley, we're talking about cultures here. What about the culture of the workplace, and how did you find yourself supported or not supported? Because I think employers are one of the groups that is not quite always there yet when it comes to that part in the job description that says or equivalent.
Correct.
Can you talk about some of that?
For myself and the experience that I have just recently being in the oil and gas industry, and prior to that in the utility industry, I would say the impact needs to happen in the area of acknowledgement and of credentials from experience. So, for example, my role as a manager, a mid-level manager at an oil and gas organization, there was a minimum qualification of 10 years of experience. And in my job, when applying, I didn't have that undergrad degree, and they were interested in looking at my skill set and my competencies in the role. And I was hired and lasted 5 years in that industry. And for those that have worked in oil and gas, it can be a tough industry to sustain yourself. And so 5 years, it was a great opportunity to also work with our human resource department. So that, I believe, is the area that those individuals can contribute to the standardization and ensuring that there is a framework or some type of standard that can be used to assess experience. And I don't believe that is there today. As a leader in my previous company, it was our role to convince the human resource department or our directors or our senior leaders that experience was equivalent to those credentials.
Thank you. Harvey, systemic change, barriers, initiatives, where do we help our systems get rid of some of the barriers? How do we help our systems to, in the rush and the need to grab students, chasing the dollar, how do we reboot a system as entrenched as the Ontario one for those that didn't finish high school, that started a degree or a college program and didn't finish it, and are sitting out there without a completed credential?
Good question. So as I say, we were asked by the Ontario government each of the colleges and universities was asked to submit a statement about what they're good at, what their intentions were, what their aspirations were, etc. And we were asked by the provincial government to convene an expert panel to assess essentially those submissions and where the Ontario system was going. What is the most important commentary you have for us? And I would say that one of the most important comments the expert panel makes is, if you're going to rely on the institutions to do it, forget it. It's not going to happen. they have a whole set of constraints on them. And if you leave this to an organic process where they'll come, you know, the light bulb will go off, we'll be sitting here 50 years from now having the same conversations. That for things to change, government has to be more active in driving that change and steering it, not necessarily telling you how to do it, but what the goal is. So here's the really good news for everyone sitting in this room. Every time a government has gotten serious about something, an outcome, let's say like recognition of prior learning or recognizing other forms of learning, and has put a 10-cent dollar in front of the institutions kill themselves for that 10-cent dollar and they'll move you there. And the Canadian higher education system, very much like every other public system, chases the dollar. And so if you want this to be, I will tell you what the expert panel would have answered to that. This is not that difficult. If you want to make this a priority, make it a priority, put a little bit of funding behind it, and you'll get there faster than you think you ever could. But don't expect this to happen in an organic, bottoms-up way from the institutions. For a whole set of reasons, it's not in them. And they have other things, frankly, that bring in more money that they have to worry about. So make it a priority, put some funding behind it, and you will see fast movement. I will say one other thing. We brought the Chancellor, we're big fans of the Western Governors University. Western Governors University was started as the name implies, by Western governors in the United States. It's now franchised in about, I think, 20 states in the United States. So let's assume I work at a bank. I'm a bank teller. I'm a single parent. I'm 32 years old, and I decide I want more out of my life than being a bank teller till I'm 65 years old. So I need to upgrade my credentials. I call the Western Governors University, and I get attached to an individual mentor who says, okay, what do you want to be? And I say, well, you know, I'd like to work in the executive suite of the bank. And they say, fine. Here's the knowledge, skills, and competencies you need to work in the executive offices of the Royal Bank. Now, let's do an assessment of what skills, knowledge, and competencies you already have. And they assess that. And then they say, well, here's the gap. And then they help you find courses anywhere in the world where you can take courses, programs that'll fill that gap. And when they assess that you have acquired the knowledge, skills, and competencies by taking these courses at your own pace, at your own time, wearing your pajamas in the basement if you want, then they give you a degree that is recognized by the state. Now, I don't know why we can't do this here, but it seems to me that organizations like that address exactly some of the issues that this organization, rightfully so, serious issues that it deals with. So it's doable.
Thank you. I have other questions that I could ask, but I wanted to stop because we moved towards 10 o'clock and see if there are questions from the floor that people can put in a loud voice to any one of our panelists, any part of their experience. I know we all want to know how Shelley is doing with her courses at Dal. Maybe you could tell us that before we go to the floor.
Sure. So my first course was May through August, and I achieved a grading of A-. And I'm in my second course and have only submitted one assignment, and that one was a B+. So I'm on my way in my second course.
Wonderful. Diane Gordon.
So I'm going to make you optimistic. So the question is that there are some in the university, perhaps many, who would express the view that a university education is not about preparing people for a job, it's about being a critical thinker, doing research, yada, yada, and it's the employer's job to actually teach you how to do the job. First of all, she's dead wrong. And if you look at the stuff coming out of the Association of Universities and Colleges of Ontario, if you look at statements being made by university presidents, geez, it's all about job readiness and preparation for the workplace. So something out there is changing. That's number one. Number two, it's ironic that a social worker told you that, because social work, like medicine, like law, like a variety of other, like engineering, are accredited professions. And let me tell you, she doesn't decide the curriculum for social work. It's the accreditation body for the social work groups that set the curriculum. In the same way that the Professional Engineers, so the Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board sets the curriculum for engineering schools. In the same way that the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons now says that when we're now going to start credentialing residency programs based upon skills and competencies, not about how long you spent in the emergency room treating patients, right? So we know where this is going, and it will be inevitable that the issue of skills and measuring skills and competencies is going to become far more prominent in the world of universities. Is part of the job to make you a critical thinker, being able to do research? Sure, but why isn't that a job skill? Most employers I know think that they want to hire critical thinkers, people who can solve problems, are creative and innovative. That's part of job readiness. And so it's not necessarily knowing how to weld, this thing over here, but that's as much a job skill as everyone else. The world is moving to measuring these things, and all of that is nothing but good news for an organization like this. Look, that's part of it, right? There's no point in assessing without actually, but again, what's exciting to us is that it's all part of this great movement to worry more about, the higher education system has been built around credit hours and the number of hours you sit in a classroom. And whether you took the courses and the prescribed pattern that some faculty member who studied this 40 years ago decided you should take, right? What's exciting about what's happening in higher education now is it's not that it's evaporating overnight, because it's not, it's taking a while. But what is changing is the recognition that it is all about measuring competencies, skills, and knowledge, and giving people credit for that. Transfer credit is now becoming an issue of, I have a 2-year certificate from this college, I then want to go to a 4-year degree program at a university, how much credit should I get? That shouldn't be based upon the whim of some administrator who you find in a registrar's office, right? That should be based upon, what do you know? What can you do? What do you got to know and be able to do for this job? And how much, therefore, do you have to learn? And we're moving there, and some places are moving there faster than others, but I think the march towards that is simply inevitable, and part of that will be recognition. It has to be. Right now, for many universities, especially the big ones, neither the culture nor the incentives are there to have them attend a lot to the issues you raised.
Sure. So the question is, when I attended my Carleton University for my undergraduate studies, whether Indigenous forms of learning were recognized by the university, and whether I see that happening more now. No, the answer is no. It's really sort of a situation that I commented on earlier, this concept of sort of a reductionist view of Indigenous forms of learning as being ones that we should relegate to this concept of culture or potentially just language. And I think that that's where some of the boundaries have to be crossed in terms of trying to promote Indigenous knowledge systems and empower them, recognize them as something sort of equal to the existing mainstream systems. I was actually asked by the University of Alberta some years ago to meet with them through a UNESCO initiative to talk about rethinking the curriculum for the first year Bachelor of Education students, to introduce to them from the first year the concept that there are Indigenous knowledge systems at play as well as Western knowledge systems, and that those knowledge systems come from peoples within those communities, within those Indigenous nations. And so I think that a lot of the discussion that UNESCO has tried to contribute throughout, you know, the work that CAPLA has done. CAPLA, by the way, is a member of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO as well, and the Canadian Commission has been really active in some of the meetings on RPL, and has also, you know, sort of supported the Indigenous RPL Collective, which we have somebody in the audience who just came back from Chile from a meeting on that particular issue. With the Vancouver Island University team, a wonderful group of people who will be offering all of you an opportunity to look at some of the model that they've created on Indigenous forms of learning, which I think is of significant value for this gathering. But a lot of it has sort of been sifted out as this concept of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing being the recognition, maintenance, and strengthening of language and culture. But I don't think it's just that. And I think that one of the unique things about Indigenous forms of knowing is that they are both individual and collective. And that's part of the challenge, I think, in terms of how people think about how do we integrate this, how do we recognize this. And so thinking about collectively held knowledge, or knowledge that doesn't reside in a particular expert or isolated in a particular text, I think that's part of the challenge that we have to face, is where does reconciliation happen in that type of environment? And I think I trust in all of you to solve that problem for us. Thank you.
No, but logically it should, right? I mean, because the issue is exactly the same. Someone comes to Canada from some other country, they have some credential or some certificate, diploma, degree that they got from some institution, and now they want to enter a profession or do a certain kind of work in Canada. How do we assess whether they have the skills and knowledge to do that, to work in that profession? And if not, and if they don't, what do they still have, what skills and knowledge do they have? What do they still have to learn so that they would meet what we would consider to be the requirements of these jobs here? The interesting thing to me is that the professions, engineering and medicine in particular, are way ahead of most other professions, most other parts of the university in this. They worry about it a lot for all the reasons you understand, right? And so logically, that discussion, the issue you're raising, is easily embedded in the discussion about measuring learning outcomes and measuring competencies. Right now, I don't think it is very well integrated.
Can I ask, I have a final question for Shelley, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up. I was thinking that, you know, you've been very sort of brave and resourceful to get where you wanted to go. What advice would you have for somebody else setting out on the journey that you've taken?
Keep going. It's a difficult and very daunting process. Seek out the support that's available to you. I think it's so important that people are aware of the support systems that are in place. And I would just encourage anyone taking on the task of putting together a portfolio or having their prior experience acknowledged to just continue to pursue forward.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank all three of you for a very interesting take on where we are and where we might get to with our collective will and a few dollars. Please join me in thanking our panelists.